Thank you so much for coming to the forum today. We are thrilled that there was such amazing turnout and engagement. And thank you to all the speakers and panelists that we had throughout the day. We're so grateful that you were able to come on a Saturday and share the really interesting work that you're doing at the intersection of socialism and civil law.
So Kama is, I'm not sure, Dodake, Montreal-based community organizer, movement builder, writer, poet, storyteller, curator, and multidisciplinary conceptual artist, whose work focuses on narration and cultural production as modes of anti-colonial resistance. The medium of Kama's work ranges from performance to textiles, from storytelling to print, from poetry to photography and film. Kama a cofondé Couleur, un festival artistique annuel qui célèbre l'art et la vie des personnes queer et transracisées de Montréal. Kama est aussi la fondatrice et l'animatrice de Gender Blender, la seule scène ouverte queer de Montréal. Kama est très activement impliquée auprès de différents mouvements en justice sociale et milite beaucoup autour de l'antiracisme, la justice migrante, la justice du genre et la mobilisation trans. Kama est originaire de l'île Maurice et a d'abord immigré en Inde à l'âge de 18 ans et vit à Dodake, Montréal depuis septembre 2011. Kama's speech tonight is called Grasping at Power Through Language, Resistance Through Poetry and the Law. Thanks.
Okay, so good evening everyone. I'm going to try to be loud enough, but if my tone kind of like falters during the talk, please remind me to be loud enough. So it is an immense pleasure for me to be able to be here this evening and engage with you all. I start by acknowledging the lens on which we presently are. I start by extending my gratitude to the traditional keepers of this lands, the Ganari, the indigenous communities who for centuries have cared for these territories, have tended to these lands, the same lands that nurture us, that shelter us, that give us our food, that give us the oxygen that we breathe. I invite you all to join me in honoring these peoples and to acknowledge the harm that was done to them as they were displaced, killed, their lands, resources, cultures, belief systems taken away from them for our benefit as settlers, to be here, to live here, and to thrive here. I invite you to think about our individual and collective responsibility in repairing, healing, being accountable, and making amends for the violence that was done to this land, and for the bones that still lie somewhere unacknowledged on these territories. I thank Rad Law, of course, for inviting me to speak today. As a grassroots organizer myself, I know how hard it is to pull resources together to create spaces of civic, political, intellectual engagement that are radical in their thinking and content, I like to think, and that take directions from marginalized communities. So I thank all the volunteers who ran around, people who designed flyers, who coordinated meetings, who took minutes in meetings, who made Facebook events, who looked into catering options, who did translation work, who sent dozens of funding applications so we could be here today. So thank you so much for all your work. And I also want to thank all the invisibilized labor that goes into creating spaces such like these, particularly the labor of people who can't be here, people who clean this space so that we can be in this clean, sanitized, comfortable, warm space to engage in our conversations. I extend my gratitude to the janitors, the cleaners, all the people who clean our washrooms, people who clear the snow in front of the building, people who take the trash out of this building so that we can be here. A lot of times those people are migrants, those people are people of color, those people are poor or working class people who actually do not have access to a conference like this one, who are actually honored in this space right now, and I think that's something that's important to acknowledge. And I also need to take a moment to acknowledge and honor my friends, my support network, my community of marginalized folks, of femmes of color, of queer and trans people of color, the friends and loved ones who have physical and mental disabilities, the people who are around me who are survivors of violence and abuse, but who still rock my world, who sustain me, who love me, who allow me to be myself, who hold me accountable, who challenge me and hold space for me and others in our communities. This is really important to me because everything that I will be talking about today is about me, but it's also about them. I can only do the work that I do as an artist, as an organizer, as a movement builder, because of them, because they make the world a safer place for me, and everything I do is for them and dedicated to them. Finally, I want to call into this space the spirit of all my trans sisters, living and dead. I stand here today to speak with you all, but my voice, my narrative, my story is only one of many voices, many narratives, and many stories. Our lives are multiple, nuanced, and I want to invoke into this space femme ancestry, feminized energy, femme magic in all its forms, the matriarchy, the lineage of trans women and femmes who resisted colonial violence across history. So I will quickly give you a quick rundown. I always like to start by actually quickly naming my positionality, because I think my position really informs what I talk about, and I think that's important to name. So I come from the Republic of Mauritius, which is a plantation island, former British and French colony. I grew up in an inter-ethnic, inter-religious, mixed-race, black, brown, working-class family of indenture origins, where abuse was pretty normalized. I am fluent in English, French, and Mauritian Creole, and I am the first in my family to have completed high school. I am the first in my family to have gone to university. I say this because a university education has actually given me tremendous amounts of privilege. Concretely, a university education has allowed me to have a solid command of the English language, which is probably why I'm invited to be speaking with all of you today, and has allowed me to articulate complex ideas through language, and has given me the potential for class mobility. So that's a little bit about who I am. Okay, talking to the lawyers and future lawyers. So what I'm going to be presenting today is intellectual labor, but it is also emotional labor, and it is also very much lived experience. What I'm trying to say is that I'm not presenting an academic talk. I'm not presenting something that has the rigorousness of university research, complete with footnotes, references, cross-references, and all that. While I acknowledge that there is something valuable to intellectual labor done in university settings, I also denounce academia as violence. I denounce universities as institutions of privilege that are built on racist, sexist, misogynist, classist, ableist legacies that reproduce the same elitist standards instead of challenging them. And the reason why I say this is because I guess what I want to outline here is that there are multiple histories of resistance. There are multiple histories of resistance and of resilience, and there are very long histories of knowledge creation and knowledge transmission that have existed for centuries, but that have largely gone unacknowledged, invisibilized, erased, or delegitimized by Western science or Western academia. I strongly believe that as people of color, as marginalized people, we have an amazing capacity at navigating the world and at getting by. When you have lost your belief systems, when you have been shackled, taken away from your land, your culture, your people, when you have been forcibly bought and sold into forced and degrading labor, and when for generations and generations, your lives and bodies have been systematically treated as disposable, undesirable, deficient, and you can barely find any positive representation and reflection of yourself in society, in the media, in any forms of archives or knowledge that you are actually seeking. And when despite all this, you actually manage to find ways to navigate the world, materially and spiritually, when despite all this, you manage to perform the intellectual and emotional labor that allows you to get by, that allows you to survive, that allows you and the future generations not only to survive, but to thrive, This for me, just here, this is knowledge. This is knowledge about how to navigate the world and how to make do with the material and spiritual realities that are available to us, and to get out into the world and exist and thrive. And this is the kind of knowledge that I'm referring to. This is the kind of knowledge that I want to honor today. It's the kind of knowledge that you learn through lived experience, that no university course can actually teach you. It's the everyday knowledge that we discover individually. It's the knowledge that we share collectively. It's the knowledge that we share from each other, but more than anything, it's also the knowledge that we share with other generations. So, on this note, I'm super excited that I actually get to address lawyers and future lawyers predominantly today. And not any future lawyers for that matter, those who are studying at the McGill University Faculty of Law. I think it's safe for me to assume that I get to speak with the cream of the cream. And not only just the cream of the cream, because apparently that's the radical part of the cream. So we'll call you the sour cream. So this is something that I actually take very seriously. When I think about the seat of power, that space where power and power structures are consolidated and uphold themselves, the first thing that comes to mind for me are governments and the law. Like, that's the first thing that always comes to mind for me. So for me, as a working class, displaced trans femme of color who has lived under precarious financial and legal status for a lot of my life, and as somebody whose work is located in grassroots organizing, to be able to address all of you today, future lawyers, is pretty amazing. And that's something that I take very seriously. This is maybe my one chance, maybe the only chance I ever get, to get closer to that seat of power. And I spend a lot of time thinking, what would I want to tell a group of future lawyers? How am I, through the use of language, through a speech basically, build a bridge between the streets where I am and the courtrooms where you all are? I'll start by quoting from an article that I wrote a few months ago, which I think the article is actually the reason why I got invited for this talk, so I think it's proper. It's an article called Femme to Femme for Femme, a love story between trans women of color. And it's an article about surviving, thriving, and finding each other and finding love as trans women and trans femmes of color. So that section goes, quote, "These days, I find myself scheming all the time. And while I used to dream of smashing the patriarchy and destroying the prison industrial complex, these days I only find myself strategizing like a locksmith, trying to figure out which doors and windows I can open for others, finding gigs, creating spaces, making food, correcting CVs, writing reference letters, applying for funding, creating jobs, pulling strings and ropes to access hormones, switching names on health insurance claims, letting folks crash on my couch, being an ear, a shoulder, a pair of arms. The dream of being saved by a rich white man, the rich white man being a lawyer, of course, is one that I have long discarded. If folks in position of power wanted to make things better for us, they would have done so by now. These days, the battle is about building resources and sharing them and clawing at power in every single way possible in the hope that some of it might trickle down to our communities." End quote. So, the reason why I specifically chose to quote this section is because I realized that just as much as I regard the law as the seat of power, as the consolidation of power, I never actually myself access the law or try to adopt the legal route in doing my work. Don't get me wrong, I might do shady things that sometimes involve maybe twisting the law, and that would maybe get me into trouble if I got caught. But generally speaking, I tried not to go the legal route. Recently, a non-status woman, trans woman of color in Ontario, wrote to me, sent me an email because she's trying to get her status regularized. So she told me in her email that she was advised to see a lawyer, but she has a little money and she would rather use it to get hormones. And what did I think she should do? Of course, my response to her was, please go get hormones. If you really, really, really need legal advice, go to a legal clinic, but please don't spend money on a lawyer. And interestingly enough, I realized while through this process that I obtained my permanent residence a few weeks ago, and it was a 5-year process that got me there, and I realized that throughout this 5-year process, I never consulted a lawyer. So how did I even make it happen, right? Like, how do you figure out, how do you go through the loopholes of bureaucracy and Canadian immigration system, because I still had a lot of resources. I didn't consult a lawyer, but I still consulted my community. And because that's also where power lies. And that's a different kind of power. That's a kind of power that is accessible. And that's the kind of power that's located in lived experience. That's the kind of power that actually doesn't cost money, because there are networks of people who, through their lived experience, have learned how to resist, have learned how to figure out the system. And we share that kind of information. We know this, we know the systems and we know the functionings because of our lived experience, because we had to go through it. And for me, this is what grassroots organizing also looks like. This is what everyday organizing looks like, and this is what everyday resistance looks like. So I guess my question then would be, speaking from the streets, this is the streets, this is the courtroom, from the streets to the courtroom. So I guess my question to the courtroom from the streets would be, so then how do you use power if on the streets we have those underground networks of support and resistance? How do you, from the courtrooms, use your power to reach out to those networks in accountable and responsible ways? How do you center the voices from here in your work? How do you forego your own power and maybe let it trickle down a little bit to the streets? And what does that look like? What does that grassroots resistance look like? How do you keep operating in your own legal fields, but by centering the lived experiences of marginalized communities? And how do you enhance and actually strengthen the types of knowledge that get developed in the streets, but that don't get developed in the courtroom? I'm going to leave that as questions for all of you, future lawyers, but I'm happy to talk about it more during the discussion after. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about poetry, because I guess that's what I'm supposed to be doing here. Talk about poetry in the law. Yeah, I had like 5 people coming up to me before I started the talk telling me, I was planning to go home, but apparently you're talking about poetry and I'm tired of hearing about law, so let me talk about poetry. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how, why art, poetry is important to me. I like to think about politics, actually, the field of politics, as an aesthetic practice. I like to think of society as an aesthetic practice. What do I mean by this? Society is structured in very particular ways, right? Like certain people have power, certain people don't, certain people are allowed to say things, certain people don't, certain people are allowed to jaywalk, other people can't. So society is structured in very particular ways, and those structures are not coincidental, they're very deliberate. They're systems that have been consolidated. It has everything to do with power and who holds power. So a way of thinking about it is like, think about it as a painting, as a frame. Like, so the word is painted in a certain way, where certain things in the painting are visible, certain things in the painting are in the shadows, and then certain things are just like out of the frame altogether. So, which is how society is ordered and structured. So, and I like to think as the moment, I like to think of the moment of resistance. I like to think of the political movement as having that frame of society, for me, it's that moment where something shifts in that frame. So there's like a particular order in terms of what should be in the light, what should be in the shadows, and what should be outside of the frame. And for me, the political moment is when something that's in the shadows actually comes to light, or something that's outside of the frame actually comes into the frame. And for me, that's how I think of the political moment, and that's how I think of resistance. So the content of a lot of my work is actually framed by everydayness. I'm really interested in like everydayness and everyday resistance. I explore the multiple ways mostly in which queer and trans racialized communities learn to make do with the material and spiritual realities readily available to them, to oppose patriarchal, nationalist, misogynist, white supremacist structures that are imposed in their everyday life, in their everydayness. And what comes out of this often are loopholes in the systems, or reappropriations of daily tools and practices that will turn a racist gaze onto itself, or that will challenge patriarchy from within, or reiterate the failures of sexism, or delineate the boundaries of nationalism. And that happens in everyday tales of survival. Those tales of survival, my own, those of my friends, my community, strangers, those we read about in the newspapers, but more than anything, those that we never read about in the newspapers, is what actually inspire my art, is what actually inspire my work and the frame and the content of my work. So for me, art then is a political moment. For me, art is that moment where something invisible can actually become visible. My art practice for me is actually an intervention into an established order. It's not a luxury, it's not an artifice. Art is not a want, it's actually a need. It's the ability to actually narrate, to re-narrate, to imagine, to reimagine, to reconstruct the world and represent ourselves as a tool of survival. I like to think that's how we heal. I like to think that's how we reclaim ourselves, our history, and that's how we validate our bodies and our souls. Art for me is a need. It is a political need. Art is what allows me to re-narrate myself and my story and just put it out there in the world. Art is what allows me to self-determine, and with every single piece that I actually put out there, I intervene into the fabric of society. I intervene into this frame where my voice that is supposed to be outside of the frame, or my voice that's supposed to be in the shadows, can finally come to light. This is also part of a legacy that, for me, is really important to just leave for future generations. I'm using art as a name here, but you know, it's art, it's whatever you put on Tumblr, it's whatever you put on Instagram. I post selfies all the time, because yeah, it's time to put our bodies out there, because we're here and we're not represented otherwise. So a lot of what I do is also based in poetry and practices of poetry. I'm primarily a poet and a storyteller. So which means that my work is very heavily located in language. And so is the law. Both these practices are coded in language. They can only exist through language. And both are concerned with the use and placement of words, phrases, punctuations, all of which aim to convey meaning. As I had mentioned earlier, if power and power structures are consolidated through the law, and if the law only exists through language, then I think there's a direct correlation. It's no wonder that marginalized folks write so much poetry. I mean, the amount of people of color poetry out there is amazing, and the number of trans women memoirs that are out there is like amazing. So why are we marginalized people so obsessed with writing poetry, and how is that connected to the law? One of my favorite poets, actually, one of the poets who inspires me the most and has impacted my work the most, is Norahs Infinite. I don't don't know if any of you know her. She's a Black Caribbean writer who also happens to be a lawyer. And she wrote this book called Zong, which is a masterpiece. You should absolutely read it if you haven't read it. Zong, basically the Zong case, Zong was a ship that left, a slave ship that left in 1781, I think, to cross the Atlantic from West Africa to Jamaica. And basically what had happened is the captain wasn't very experienced and they got lost at sea and they didn't know what to do. And then what they decided to do was that, because they were running out of rations and stuff, so they decided to throw 150 slaves overboard so that they could claim it as insurance money once they reached the New Americas. And the only, like, I mean, it's something that you definitely look up if that's something that interests you. But what's interesting about it is like what is left of this case. Because also the slaves at the time were considered goods, so it was just lost goods during your journey across the sea, so it could be claimed as insurance money. So there's the report of that decision, Gregson versus Gilbert. So what Norahs Infinite does actually in Zong, the book, she writes that book called Zong, which is pretty interesting, where she tries to rewrite that history, where she says, as a lawyer, she goes like, oh, all that's left of that history is basically this legal text about the decision. But what about the voices? What about the slaves? What about the people who were thrown at sea? What about their stories? Do their stories even ever get told? And I'm going to give you a quote from part of the notes that Norahs Infinite wrote on Zong, which I really, really like because I think it really brings together the link but also the clash in language, thinking about poetry and the law. So, quote, I deeply distrust this tool I work with, language. It is a distrust rooted in certain historical events that are all of a piece with the events that took place on the zone. The language in which those events took place promulgated the non-being of African peoples. And I distrust its order, which hides disorder. Its logic hiding the illogic, and its rationality, which is simultaneously irrational. However, if language is to do what it must do, which is communicate, these qualities, order, logic, rationality, the rules of grammar must be present. And as it is with language, so too with the law. Exceptions to these requirements exist in religious and spiritual communication with non-human forces such as gods or suprahuman beings, in puns, parables, and of course, poetry. In all these instances, humans push against the boundary of language by engaging in language that is often neither rational, nor logical, predictable, nor ordered. It is sometimes even non-comprehensible, as in the religious practices of speaking in tongues, which fatally subverts the very purpose of language. Poetry. Poetry comes the closest in the latter type of communication. It is indeed rooted in it, not only in pushing against boundaries of language, but in the need for each poet to speak his or her own tongue. I'm going to give you, how do I do this? Okay. I'm going to quickly give you another quote and then I'm going to unpack it. The other quote is about Norahs Infinite actually writing Zong, because what she does in the book in terms of writing Zong, so she asks herself that question: how do I give a voice to all the slaves that were thrown at sea? How do I give them a voice when all I have is that one legal text where you don't even have the names of those 150 slaves that were thrown at sea? So what she does is actually she uses the legal text, the legal report, And she writes an entire book of poetry by just like twisting and subverting and repeating and playing with words. She plays with words from the legal text in trying to create a space where a different and irrational, quote-unquote irrational voice can actually emerge. So she says, while a concern with precision and accuracy in language is common to both law and poetry, the law uses language as a tool for ordering. In the instant case of talking about her book, however, I wanted poetry to disassemble the ordered, to create disorder and mayhem so as to release the story that cannot be told, which is the story of the slaves who were thrown at sea. So, for Norahs Infinite, who is a poet and a lawyer, poetry then becomes a tool of subversion. Poetry then is what allows you, through language, to actually push the realm of language, expand the realm of language, and to actually break its barriers, its confines, and expand the imagination, and through this, I argue, allow individuals and communities to find and articulate their voices, and to heal in the process. So the act of creation here, the act of resistance, is also deeply spiritual. And the use of language through poetry is also deeply spiritual. So in that sense, so using language as resistance through poetry, through art generally speaking, is spiritual, and it has to do with the representation. It has to do with the reimagination. It has to do with healing, but it also has to do with articulating what cannot be articulated in precise language, which is what the law is grounded on. And this is what language actually does in terms of our grassroots resistance, thinking about art and grassroots resistance. This is what language and poetry do in our grassroots network, and which is why they are important. So again, in terms of moving from the streets to the court, or from the court to the street, maybe the other way around, I am still left with that question of subversion of language within the law, which I'm probably going to leave you with as a question in terms of subversion within the law and how that takes place, if that is something that can take place at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that thought with us. Does anyone have questions? I don't know if you want to pick people or want me to pick people.
Actually, if you could just repeat the name of the author who's poet.
Norahs Infinite.
How do you spell it?
Nourabese, Philip. Zong, Z-O-N-G.
At what point do you feel like art was a need? Like at what point did it start at a certain point? Did you have this like realization that art was a need?
For me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I only started articulating, like using that phrase art as a need, like recently, because I don't think I had processed that art was a need until, you know, I get invited to talks like this when I'm supposed to be talking about art and saying smart things, apparently. I try. But yeah, I mean, thinking, like also I'm using art and poetry, but I think like you should feel free to also translate that into your own understandings of that, like in terms of, you know, like any form of creation, any form of creation that actually nurtures you spiritually. Because like I recently went back to my parents' house, and my mom pulled out like a tiny dress like this that apparently I had hand sewn for my cousin's doll when I was like 6 years old or something. And I was like, really? I did that when I was 6 years old? And I was really wondering, why did I even do that when I was 6 years old? But I think, yeah, it's really, like for me, I articulate it through art, you know, but for other people, maybe cooking is the need, you know, maybe, you know, like whatever that need might be, that allows you to navigate the world.
This might be a little general, but what would you like to see shift in the poetry of the law?
Oh my god. Where do I start? What do I want to see shift in poetry? Oh god, I just want more poetry everywhere all the time. I want people of color and other marginalized people to actually get published. I want the publishing industry to shift, and I want marginalized artists to get paid for their work. But also, where does the publishing industry come from? How is power consolidated in the publishing industry? Which like raises another question. But in terms of what, I have a lot of trainings for art, but I'm going to respond to the part about the law. I think it's interesting. It was really a moment for me when I got that email. So from a non-status trans woman of color based in Ontario asking me about how do I get my status regularized, do you think I should speak with a lawyer? And it was like interesting timing because I was also thinking about what I'm going to talk about here. And my reaction was actually, no, like, don't go talk to a lawyer. And I had to ask myself, why am I telling somebody, like a non-status trans woman of color right now, don't go talk to a lawyer? I mean, more than anything, she told me she'd rather use her money to get herself hormones, which I think is great. And I think there's the, you know, like, at least for me, like, I understand the law as being something that's so precise, but also something that's so obscure, right? Like, so, what I would want to see with the law would be, I guess, I want to see the lawyers and the future lawyers actually, on the one hand, challenge the system, right? Because, like, what does that mean? Like, I want to see more people, first of all, challenge the system on the one hand, and on the other hand, also just make things easier, you know? Like, just, things are so coded and elitist, and, like, it's a particular language, it's so precise, like it's so, but also it's that massive, solidified block that controls everybody's lives at like every level. And I think I would want to see this block loosen up on the one hand, and then I want, like, you know, because ultimately it's up to people who are in positions of power to push against the block. I mean, people doing grassroots organizing and grassroots resistance are doing it in the grassroots, like, you know, because I don't go the legal route because I can't do that work. I don't have the expertise to do that work, right? And I think that's the question also in terms of future lawyers, people who will have the expertise to do that work. Like, what do you do? What do you do with that? And I think that's what I want to see. Yeah.
Didi.
Yeah. So I kind of like before I ask my question, as a new lawyer who was in philosophy as a master's. And who studied Judith Butler, you know, so I studied a lot of transgender stuff, and I'm also Mauritius. That's just to place myself. I'm also Mauritian. I really have like existential issues with seeing the lawyer as the one in power, because I really don't see myself that way, and it makes me really sick. Mentally, like existentially, to see myself that way, or to feel the pressure of seeing myself that way as the lawyer in power, and to be told by professors, you're called, like Professor Gould, you're called to be the leader of wherever you're going to be, or something like that. Because frankly, this imposes a pressure, and also when you come from a disabled background, or when you come from a background of color, when you come from a disempowered background, that disempowerment defines you, and you're sent the message that suddenly you have to behave and act and think as a person in power. So my question to you, and I've always thought my way of studying law is to break that chain, to break that linearity, and to totally dismantle that division between the one in power and the one who receives, the one who advocates and the one who is represented. And I always try to say, hey, I'm not the one in power. I'm actually the traditionally disempowered person who somehow, through studying law, subverts it, but not by suddenly acting like the one in power, but that affirming that disempowerment and forcing the authorities to recognize that disempowerment. So I'm wondering if poetry does not something similar, and painting and art in general. Doesn't art and poetry totally challenges our conception of what is possible through language? And don't bodies that don't, would you think that bodies that don't follow norms challenge also the conception of what it ought to mean to be a body? And if all of this is true, shouldn't we put to the dish for once and for all the idea of the lawyer in power? And shouldn't we say to the Dean of McGill that that basically that concept of us McGill as the architects of the social structure of tomorrow, we don't want it anymore. Poets are the social structures of tomorrow. Disempowered, marginalized people are the social structures of tomorrow. They have something to teach you. So shouldn't we reverse it and call disempowerment the game changer?
Thank you for this really thoughtful, engaging, and challenging comment and question. You also said a few things through. I'm going to try to respond to whatever I can remember and whatever I can formulate in my mind right now. Where do I even start? Where do I even start? Well, where do I even start? Poetry, bodies, law, McGill. I think I think it's amazing and actually do admire people who actually are willing to go into the system to be able to subvert it from within or to challenge it from within. I tried the academia route. I couldn't, it just broke me down and I couldn't do it, and I can't be anywhere close to academia. But I really, really admire people like my friends and other people from my community who actually stick through it and challenge it and ask the hard questions and try to do the work, however detrimental that could be to their own mental health. And that's something I really admire for people who are willing to actually go in and actually dismantle something from inside. And I think that's amazing, but also the onus shouldn't be on marginalized people to actually do that work. I think that's exactly the question. It's it's that there's that sense of, I don't know, for me, I'm yeah, whatever, trans femme of color this, trans femme of color that. Yeah, I'm also so much more than that, right? I always get brought down to that one identity, you're a trans woman of color, right? And sometimes I want to be more than that. And also sometimes I don't want to be talking about my experience, and I don't want to be talking about being a trans woman of color, right? So who does that work? Who picks it up? Because I don't want to be doing that work all the time. And I think in terms of thinking about power and going into the spaces, that's also the questions that individually and collectively we should be asking ourselves, right? Because ultimately we go there with different positions of experience and privilege and access. And whatever it is, some people just have it easier than others. And I think it's admirable when you're willing to go through and do that work, but I don't think it's up to marginalized peoples to be doing that work all the time, which is one part of it. The other part of your question that I thought that I'm going to respond to was what you said about bodies, which I think was super interesting. Yeah, I do think there's something subversive about my body. I do think there is something subversive about just your existence when you are a non-normative body, but also the reality of it is that it's violent. The reality of it is that just my body might be subversive. So, okay, maybe my body is political, but I'm also punished for that, right? Street violence is real. If you don't have a normative body in society, you don't have access to spaces, you get barred from spaces, like, I mean, and you get beat up on the streets, you get assaulted, harassed, like, I mean, all those happened, right, like, at different levels, in different ways. And so, yes, there is a symbolic subversion to non-normative bodies, but there's also a violence that comes through this. And I think it's, like, I don't think just the simple fact of having non-normative bodies and spaces are subversive symbolically, but then how do we make spaces safe for those bodies? And for me, that's the question, because it's not up to people who are marginalized, to, let's say, genderqueer folks, to actually make spaces safe, because, like, we make spaces safe. It's the normative bodies and the normative systems that make spaces unsafe for us. So again, that goes back to that question in terms of, like, how do we navigate our responsibility, how do we navigate our accountability, and how do we actually use our privileges to let things trickle down, to make spaces safer for others. And the last thing I'm going to respond to is what you said about artists and poets and all of that, which I think is amazing. I love it. Yeah, of course. I think, yeah, we are the revolutionaries, I mean, we are the ones coming with the dreams and the poem and the films and in many ways, and that dream of the revolution, right? Like that we're trying, revolution, I'm using that word right now, the revolutions, with an S, that we're trying to create and that we're trying to express for our art, for our bodies, but also we're doing this, at least speaking for me, also as a grassroots artist, because I mean, I clearly don't have an MFA or anything like that. I don't get any arts funding whatsoever, right? Like, so much of my, it's like, yeah, I make art and I have made a name for myself also as an artist within the Montreal context, but I mean, nobody gave it to me. I had to go get it, and also that's the thing, I have enough privileges. I know English, I know French, I went to university, like I know how to work social media, which actually allowed me to create the visibility that I wanted for myself, but ultimately I had to teach myself now. I had to go look for it myself. So yes, we could say, we should probably talk about artists and poets as the revolutionaries and all that, but again, materially, how does that change the structure of society? Because if materially, even if we decide to call ourselves empowered, even if we decide to say we are the ones in power, concretely speaking, we don't have access to resources. Concretely speaking, it's the politicians and the lawyers and other people who have money and clout and all that who actually shift things in society. And I think there's the romanticized part of it, which I love, but there's also the very material part of it, because I mean, most grassroots artists that I know, I mean, I have a full-time job, I work 40 hours a week, sometimes 50 hours a week, and then I go home and make art, right? Like, and most of the grassroots artists that I know do the same thing. And then I know other people who have an MFA and actually have their own studio and wake up in the morning and make an espresso and make art, right? Like, and I think those are things where materially we need to also think about this in that process of, like even romanticizing our own narratives and romanticizing our own work, that materially speaking, because like for me personally, I don't romanticize my work. I'm like, no, I had to fight to get whatever I wanted today, and I'm very proud of it, but I don't idealize it.
Yeah, I guess my question maybe follows from the previous sort of thread that's developing here. But as you were speaking, I was thinking about interpretation and about the idea that communication has two sides. There's the speaker and a listener, or many speakers and many listeners. And I think that's, as someone who is absolutely not a lawyer, I do think that that's where much of the work of lawyers, especially radical lawyers, is, right? In looking for representation within texts that aren't meant to represent the types of people and types of bodies that we are, and that that we're speaking about today. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts about dialogue and about reading against the grain, whether it's in the law or in poetry, and sort of the role of the person receiving the communication in terms of interpreting it and maybe responding.
Well, I think that's the difference, I would say, between, if I got your question correctly, between poetry and the law, is that I feel poetry actually allows you that space, actually. It allows me as a writer to have the space to put in whatever I want, but then once my work is out there, it doesn't belong to me anymore. So, you know, like, there are nuances that will be caught by people, you know, like, so it becomes something else. It becomes the readers, right? Like, that you can, but with the law, that's not really the case. I mean, I could take the law and like read it as a literary text and interpret it my way, but ultimately, concretely speaking, like, you know, if something happens where I'm in the courtroom, like, my interpretation doesn't stand. And I think it's more of a question that I have for the lawyers and future lawyers, whether your interpretation, you know, I mean, really, my only interaction with the law is I watch How to Get Away with Murder every week, and I love it, but also I find it interesting because it also, for me, when I watch this, I just find it so interesting because it really, you know, it treats about like, okay, how does race play out in the courtroom, for example, right? Which is something that I find fascinating because at the same time, yes, there's this, you know, the way Norahs Infinite talks about it, there's this like solidified, concrete, like very precise text, right? But at the same time, what's beyond this? Like, what's the aesthetics that surrounds it? Like, what's the difference, I guess, when you're a black lawyer as opposed to a white lawyer, a black woman or a white man in court? Like, how do also, you know, like, what goes beyond the text, however solidified that text is? What goes beyond it that actually goes unspoken? And I think there's a lot of sort of unspokens there because, you know, there's that sense of like it's rational, it's the law, it goes back to the text, but there's so much more on the text that's actually unspoken, and I think that's something. I don't know if we talk about that in legal circles. I'm not in those circles, so
Yeah, I think that's an interesting intervention in a way because also poetry is not just about language but performance, maybe in a similar way that the law can be in the courtroom or in certain situations. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm wondering, I know there's 2 questions, 3, maybe could you say your question and then do you want to respond to everyone?
yeah, let's do that.
So maybe